You're listening to In the Crease, and I'm getting feedback, so hold 1 second, please. There we go. Apologize for that. You are listening to In the Crease, the show that slices deep into the shadows of history, peels back some of the footnotes no one else dares to read, and drags the strangest stories into the light. I am your host, JEFF, and tonight we're headed somewhere quiet, somewhere green, and somewhere very, very old. This is episode 64, The Green Children of Woolpit. Now, the story begins in a field in Suffolk around the year 1150, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later. The crops are ripe, the sun is high, and a group of English peasants stumble across something no one in the village will ever forget. Two children, pale, dirty, confused, speaking no language, dressed in strange clothes, and green. Not metaphorically, not poetically, actually green. And what follows is a mystery that refuses to die, a story passed down from over 8 centuries, one that's been called legend, miracle, myth, hoax, parable, and possibly the first alien encounter in recorded English history. What was it? Or was it something sadder, stranger, and far more human? Well, tonight we are going to dig into the chronicles, weigh some of the theories, and revisit the pit where it all began. We'll meet the girl who claimed to come from a land of eternal twilight, and the boy who didn't survive long enough to even tell his side. We'll talk a bit about famine, war, fairies, some scientific stuff I'll probably struggle saying, language, trauma, saints, sound, all of it. And then what happens when a village is confronted with something it cannot explain? 800 years of retellings, one mystery that keeps slipping out of the noose. This is In the Crease, episode 64, The Green Children of Woolpit. Now let's go down into that pit and see what comes back. So here we are in Woolpit, mid-12th century, a place of prayer, plows, and a little bit of a quiet reputation. The kind of English village where everything was small, except for the mysteries people carried inside their heads. It was harvest season, and the world moved in skies and sweat, and bushels of beans and bushels of gossip. Chickens ran loose, children learned Latin by way of hymnals, and the wolves, they said, were mostly gone. Mostly. Now, I know some of you are going, but that's not how it's called. You're correct. Not the name isn't actually Woolpit. If you pronounce it the correct way, it's Woolpit. And it came from the old wolf trapping pits still littered around the fields. Deep earthen traps covered in brush, dug centuries earlier into the woods, and they were darker, and the line between man and, beast were maybe a little more negotiable. But by the 1100s, the pits were half forgotten. More symbols, really. A reminder that danger once lived closer, that untamed things sometimes left the trees and came from, for our sheep, or worse, your soul. And that in this world, holes were dug for things that did not belong. So imagine, in this world, holes, just there. And it was a perfectly normal morning. The sun was rising over fields, still damp with the mist. Sir Richard de Coun's household stirring with servants. Peasants heading out to gather the last of the broad beans before rot or rain got to them. And then a cry. Not the bleating of a sheep, not even the shriek of a bird. Something higher, something human. Voices even. 2 of them. Childlike, wordless, and half buried. A group of reapers followed the sound toward one of the older pits, its edges now blurred with thistle and ivy. They were really expecting something along the lines of a fox, or maybe even a trick of the wind. Or even the worst fear among it, God forbid, a child from the village had fallen in while chasing something stupid. Instead, they looked down and saw two children, one boy, one girl. But it wasn't any known family from Woolpit, not from any village within walking distance, and not from anywhere that could be named at the moment. And oh, yeah, they were green. Not olive, not sickly, green. Now, later descriptions would try to make sense of it. Some called their skin tinted like leeks. Others compared it to tree moss or unripe wheat. But what mattered in the first instance wasn't shade or spectrum, it was the complete wrongness of it all. The skin of the children shimmered under the canopy of the pit like some unspoken rebuke of the natural order. Their eyes were wide and hollow with fear. They spoke in a rapid, fluid tongue that had no echo in Latin, French, or even Old English. Their clothes, woven from strange, coarse cloth, were dyed in colors the villagers didn't recognize, neither peasant's brown nor noble's velvet. One of the harvesters made the sign of the cross. Another muttered a word probably hadn't used since childhood. Changeling. Now you have to understand, in medieval England, where literacy was rare and the nearest monk was the closest living thing to a news anchor, stories lived longer than logic. People believed in signs. They believed in miracles. They believed, too, in curses. And green children appearing out of a pit? Well, that could be all three, depending on your theology. Yet fear gave way to compassion, or at least to curiosity. They were just children, after all. The villagers pulled them out, carried them toward the center of Woolpit, like something holy or haunted, or perhaps a little bit of both. And what followed, depending on how much you believe in coincidence, was either divine encounter or one of the strangest refugee stories England has ever known. Now, news traveled faster than a confession during Lent. Within the hour, the baker's apprentice was swearing up and down he'd seen their eyes glow in the dark. By afternoon, the local priest had been summoned, holy water in hand. The girl clung to the boy like a frightened fawn. She spoke only in her strange tongue, her voice thin and tremulous. The boy, smaller, said nothing at all. His eyes half-lidded, his breathing shallow. His skin was greener than hers. One thing was certain, they were clearly malnourished. Attempts to feed them failed spectacularly. A neighbor tried bread. The children recoiled. Porridge made them retch. An old crone offered a cup of goat's milk, and they spat it out, panicked and wide-eyed. 2 days they ate nothing. The rumors continue to swirl. Were they fasting for some unknown religious reason? Had they been cursed by a hedge witch? Were they even human? The priest baptized them preemptively, just to be on the safe side. Meanwhile, Sir Richard de Calne, nobleman, landholder, and reasonably well-read man, offered to take them into his household, perhaps out of Christian duty, perhaps because deep down, like everyone else in Woolpit, he couldn't look away. So we go into Sir Richard's house of curiosities. His manor stood just a mile or so from the village, its moat fed by a slow-moving stream and lined with carefully pruned willows. Inside, the children were cleaned, clothed, and given quarters that had last housed some traveling monks. Servants were instructed to be patient. The cook was warned not to force the issue of food, which made what happened next all the more bewildering. Kitchen was storing broad beans, stalks, pods, and husk. As the story goes, the moment the green children saw them, their demeanor shifted. They reached out, grabbed at them like the lifelines they were. And when they cracked the pods open and found beans inside, they devoured them, raw, unwashed, and whole. It was the first thing they'd eaten in days. The cook, albeit stunned, offered more. The children ate them all. The next day, more beans, then more, and then some more. For a while, broad beans were all they would even touch. Now, to the household, it was breathtaking. To the priest, a minor miracle. To the villagers, who were already retelling the story with glowing skin and floating eyes, it made things only that much weirder. Who eats raw beans and nothing else? Who cries in joy over a stalk of legumes? Who wanders into your world through a hole in the ground, then survives on peasant feed? No one really had answers. The girl was changing. She started to smile more. She spoke, still in her unknown tongue, but with more confidence. She learned to hold a cup properly. Her green hue, once deep and unsettling, began to fade into something closer to pale olive. Then tan, then normal. The boy didn't change fast enough. By the time the priest baptized him, the boy was already weakening. He barely responded to touch. He spoke very little, slept too long. And the girl stayed by his side, whispering in their unknown language. No one knew what was being said. There's a strong possibility maybe she didn't either. When he died, he was buried quickly, as was the usual practice. No mother to grieve, though, no name to chisel into the stone. Just a shrouded bundle lowered into the earth under a wooden cross marked with a date no one would remember outside the chronicles. Woolpit had taken in 2 children. Well, it had but one. But she was learning fast. The girl, soon to be named, though we'll never know what her real name was, began picking up the local dialect. First some nouns, then some short sentences. She shadowed the other girls in the manner, listening more than actually speaking. By the end of the year, she would communicate. And when she could communicate, they asked, where had she come from? Why was her skin even green? And what was the language she was speaking? And she gave them an answer, or rather, she gave them a story. Come from St. Martin's Land. That was the name she gave it. Not a country, not a village, not a family estate. A land. Where the sun never fully rose, where everything was tinged with green, where the people worshipped St. Martin and attended churches that looked almost familiar. She described a world of twilight, not darkness, not night, but an endless dusk, like the hours just before the sun disappears. The kind of light that makes shadows seem a little bit taller and colors more uncertain. She and her brother, she said, had been herding animals near a cave. They had heard the sound of bells, church bells, faint and strange. So they ended up following that sound, into the cave and through the dark. And then, suddenly, they were in Woolpit. No explanation, no route, just a shift in space, a shift in light, and a shift in world. To her, this made perfect sense. To everyone else, it sounded like either a divine revelation or a child trying to make sense of trauma the only way she knew how. Sir Richard took her words seriously. The priest, less so. The villagers, being the villagers that they were, well, they just added to the long list of oddities. But we know she had survived. She was no longer green, and now she was speaking English, or close enough to English. She knew how to knead bread and say grace. But she was still a mystery. And in a village like Woolpit, mysteries don't die, they tend to evolve. Now, the girl would grow older, possibly Mary, possibly Lee, possibly just being forgotten entirely by the world outside of Woolpit. But inside, her arrival would be retold again and again by firelight, by alehouse, and by cautionary tale. 2 green children appeared in the harvest fields. One died, one lived. And the pit that once caught wolves had caught something stranger. Now, with history, we're often told the history is written by the victors, and it's usually accurate. But in the 12th century, history was written by monks, mostly the kind with, bad teeth, worse hair, and sharp quills, and a tendency to insert random ghost stories between records of taxation and saintly miracles. So when it came time to record the tale of Woolpit's green children, the girl who claimed to be from St. Martin's Land, and the boy who died too soon to say anything, the job would fall to not one chronicler, but 2. They would never meet the children. They never visited the village. But they wrote the story down anyway. Because let's face it, some tales are too strange to leave untold, whether that's made up or not. So let's start with William of Newburgh, a canon regular of a monastery up at Yorkshire. He's best described as the medieval equivalent of a skeptical academic with a penchant for ghost stories. Now, William wasn't in the business of fairy tales. His history of English affairs was meant to chronicle the serious events of the time: battles, kings, disasters, politics, things like that. But somewhere between the account of King Stephen's miserable reign and an anecdote about animated corpses crawling out of graves — yes, that's really a story that I might cover in season 5 — he includes the story of the Green Children, albeit reluctantly. He all but apologized to the reader for doing so. Now, I know this sounds ridiculous, he basically said, but there were just too many respectable people who swore it was true. His source? Unknown. His tone? Wary, but sincere. He even admits up front that it defies logic. 2 children, green-skinned, unable to speak the language, eating nothing but raw beans, just appeared from a hole in the ground, and one would die. The other learns English and describes a world bathed in perpetual twilight. To William, this wasn't folklore, it was a phenomenon. And like any responsible historian of his age, he wrote it down. Right after chronicling a couple vampire incidents, and before returning to more normal events like royal tax disputes. And I wish I was making all of that up, and I am not. That's the key to understanding William. To him, the miraculous and the mundane shared the same parchment. Then there's Ralph of some really English-sounding name, something like Hogshale, the abbot of a monastery down in Essex. Closer, a little bit, to Woolpit, a little bit closer to the source. Ralph included his version of the Green Children in the Chronicon Angelicum, written some decades after William's. And while his account is shorter, he claims something William didn't: first-hand testimony. Now, according to Ralph, he got the story directly from Sir Richard Decane, the very man who took the children in and raised the girl. That makes Ralph's version a bit of a second-hand account, 1 degree from the actual witness, which, let's face it, for medieval standards means he was basically there. Now, Ralph added several details that William either didn't know or chose not to include. He named the land they said they came from St. Martin's Land. He emphasized that everything in that land was green, not just the people, but the fields, the rivers, the light itself. He also described the cave more explicitly, and the sound of bells that lured the children in. And that part struck a chord with a lot of the readers. Bells meant churches, and churches meant Christianity. So how could 2 Christian children be so utterly alien? Now, the 2 chronicles agree on the core facts of this story, The children were discovered during harvest. They spoke no known language. They refused all food except raw beans. The boy died shortly after baptism, and that the girl survived, learned English, and claimed to come from a strange land with no full daylight. But then they diverge in the subtle, meaningful ways. William places the event during the reign of King Stephen, somewhere between 1135 and 1154. Ralph, on the other hand, says it happened under King Henry II, so that's post 1154, potentially into the 1160s and 1170s. And that's not a small difference. That's two kings, one civil war, and a fair bit of national trauma between them. So either one of them got it wrong, or they were each working off separate retellings. Let's face it, oral tradition has never been a truly reliable timekeeper. And there are other variances as well. Ralph emphasizes the children's inability to eat normal food and how desperate they were for the beans. Williams, he mentions it, doesn't dwell on it. William, interestingly, refers to the girl as wanton and impudent once she grew up. Ralph uses even spicier language. Lasciva et patunis. Let's just say naughty, which translated from monk speak, basically means she had a bit of a sense of humor and didn't take orders from pious men. Now, according to William, the girl eventually left Woolpit, married a man from King's Lynn, and lived a normal life. If you can call a former alien bean eater becoming housewife normal. Some later researchers tried to track her down. One suggested she may have become a woman named Agnes Barry, who married a royal official named Richard Barry, a man known to have ties to Sir Richard de Calne. Well, let's face it, that is a hell of a coincidence. If true, it means the girl from the pit didn't just survive, she ascended from mystery to marriage, from outsider to English gentry. But that's just a theory. We have no documentation to prove the connection. It's just a possibility, not a conclusion. And in a story like this, the possibility is, well, kind of where everything resides. But let's zoom out a little bit. Whether the Green Children appeared under King Stephen or Henry II, England in the mid-1100s was not a calm place. Stephen's reign, often called the Anarchy, was brutal, had bloody civil war, nobles fighting noble, castles changing hands almost weekly, if not daily, whole towns being razed and rebuilt, famine, displacement, and even foreign mercenaries running wild. While Henry II's reign, comparably, was a bit more stable, but not by much. His sons rebelled against him, nobles schemed in the background, and in 1173, just miles from Woolpit, one of the bloodiest confrontations occurred, the Battle of Fornham. And here's why this matters. At Fornham, King Henry's forces crushed a coalition of rebellious nobles. Among them were Flemish mercenaries who had been imported into England by the Earl of Leicester. Many were killed, others scattered. And in the aftermath, anti-Flemish sentiment surged. Some local English lords saw Flemish communities as traitors. Families disappeared, homes were burned, children went missing. Now, unlike the rest of the story, this isn't speculation. This is documented. In Fornham, did we mention, it's barely a half-day's walk from Woolpit. So a new theory begins to bloom. What if the children were real? What if they weren't from some fantasy land? What if they were Flemish? Let's explore it. They spoke a language no one understood. Now, medieval Flemish sounds nothing like Old English. Their clothes were strange. Continental styles often looked alien to English peasants. They avoided food. Traumatized kids often refused unfamiliar meals. They were found near harvest season, exactly when chaos was settling from the rebellion. They came from St. Martin's Land, possibly a garbled version of Fornham St. Martin, a real Flemish settlement in the region. But I know what you're saying. The green skin. Well, some medical historians have proposed a diagnostic answer for this. Hyperchromic anemia, also called green sickness, a condition caused by severe malnutrition and iron deficiency, which can result in a noticeable greenish color. When fed properly, say, oh, I don't know, with beans rich in iron, colors fade, just like the story. But then, why the bells? Why the cave? It's easy to dismiss those details as imaginative retellings. But what if they weren't metaphors? Picture it. Two Flemish children, young, confused, traumatized, are hiding in an abandoned mine shaft or chalk tunnel during or after a massacre. They hear church bells. They follow the sound, even crawling toward it, and emerge into a village that sees them as something other. They're hungry, weak, apparently inarticulate to these people, and they're dressed in foreign clothes. Oh, and green. So the story spreads, the facts begin to blur, and by the time it gets to two monks with quills, it becomes myth. Real trauma becomes wonder. And that's how history works sometimes. And sometimes that's just how it survives. But let's not pretend William and Ralph here were just scribbling legends for sheer entertainment. They had reasons. In the 12th century, England was still wrestling with ideas of Christianity versus paganism, civilization versus wildness, community versus outsider. To some, the green children were a parable, an allegory. Two strangers fall from the earth, one dies, the other is baptized, learns the language, marries, and becomes one of them. It's about assimilation or conversion or just survival. Pick your metaphor. They all kind of fit here. And as weird as the story is, the ending is almost conservative. The girl sheds her greenness, learns English, marries, becomes normal. Yay, the system wins. But the details won't just die. Despite the neatness of the ending, the story never settled. It still lingers. Because the details are too strange, too specific, and too human to be dismissed entirely. We want to believe there's something more to it. We want to believe a tunnel between worlds, a shimmered veil between light and shadow, a place where dusk never ends and St. Martin still hears prayers in a language lost to time. Somewhere, maybe, St. Martin's land still waits. Or, maybe it never existed at all. Except in the mind of one green girl trying to explain the unexplainable. We have William of Newburgh, Ralph of Coggeshall, one skeptical, the other closer to the source. Both recorded something they really couldn't explain, but dared not to ignore. Because stories like this, stories that blur that line between miracle and metaphor, have a way of surviving long after the monks are nothing but dust. And whether it was just a tale of war refugees, fairy children, or accidental tourists from another world, the mystery didn't die in that pit. It walked out, and it spoke some English about it, and it refused to go away. With that, we will be back in about 3.5 or so minutes. Thank everyone for tuning in, whether it's KLRN Radio on X, SHR Media on YouTube, KLRN at Rumble, and my own feeds. I greatly appreciate it. We will be right back.
Spoke no name, sunlight burned but didn't warm. to me. I mimic songs I've never heard. Your harvest moon, your knives, your kings all taste like ash beneath your words. I walked a spiral to your gate. No path back home, no map to trace. You stare like mirrors that won't break, but I still wear another place. Your hands build walls around the name you say is mine, but fits all wrong. I am the node between the chords, the child of dusk, the hour gone long. Neither root nor star, neither wound nor scar, just a sound that doesn't echo here, just a soul you'll never hear.
And welcome back. Oh, I almost didn't make it back in time. It's one bad thing about a fractured ankle. I don't quite move with the speed I used to. I have to remember that and make longer intermission music next time. Now, where does the story take us from here? Well, when a story refuses to die for 800 years, there are basically two possibilities. It's either a skeleton in history's closet, or it's a mirror we keep turning to see ourselves in. And I think for the tale of the Green Children of Woolpit, I think I'm going to embrace the power of and here. Because no matter how many monks wrote it down or scholars tried to explain it, we keep coming back to the relatively same unanswerable question. Who, or what, were they? And often when logic taps out, the speculation begins. So tonight, in true ITC fashion, we're going to sort the theories like tools on a bench. Some are going to be blunt instruments, and some are scalpel sharp, and, well, one or two may be a little radioactive. But all of them, in some way, are trying to shine light into that pit. So we're going to jump into the big one. Okay? Long before Area 51, before alien autopsies and green and gray skin memes, there was a different otherworld. It was closer, wilder, less about distant galaxies and more about the hill behind your cottage. A stream that whispered too clearly. The barrow you were warned never to disturb. In medieval England, the fairy realm wasn't metaphor. It was geography, a parallel reality just beneath the surface. You didn't need warp speed to visit. You needed a little bit of bad luck and a poorly timed walk through the woods. And the story of the Green Children kind of fits this folklore like a velvet glove. Strange speech? That's a check. Alien dress? Yep, absolutely. Green tinted skin? I mean, hello. Color of fairy blood. Fear of bread and meat? Well, let's face it, that's kind of classic fairy lore. Only eating beans, possibly the one crop shared between worlds. And the cave is a portal? Well, it's a direct hit. Fairy mounds and tunnels are traditional entrances to the other world. Girl's own description of St. Martin's Land reads more like a fairy territory, eternal twilight, a place where Christian saints exist, but dimly, like echoes through a forest, a spiritual halfway house between our worlds and theirs. In fact, there is a specific fairy category in British lore for these kinds of encounters, called intrusions from the other side, which also would make a really good song. I need to make sure I write that one down. Now, when people stumbled out of wood, confused, altered, and unable to describe where they'd been, or children appeared from nowhere with stories of twilight lands, these were not treated as fiction. They were treated as cautionary tales. And even the green hue isn't an anomaly. In many fairy traditions, green isn't just a color, it's a warning. The sign of something neither dead nor alive, a creature touched by something older than man and deeper than language. So, under this theory, the green children didn't immigrate. They escaped, or worse, they were cast out. Or maybe they wandered too far from the sounds of the bell, which in many traditions banish the Fae. As if the ring of Woolpit's Abbey didn't just bring them to our world, it could have trapped them here. And while the boy withered and died, unable to adjust, the girl learned the rules of our world. She unlearned the Fae way. She ate human food, spoke human words, and slowly, the Fae, the green, faded. No, I know. I already mentioned Area 51, so let's go here with number 2. It was only a matter of time before someone said, "Oh, wait, green skin, strange language, mysterious origin? Are we sure they weren't from, space?" So let's enter the extraterrestrial theory. Now, this version exploded in the 20th century, right when the public started swapping angels for astronauts and fairies for flying saucers. Proponents claim the children were not from another country or even another dimension. They were, in fact, from another planet. A dying world trapped in twilight, perhaps one tidally locked to its star, where one hemisphere bakes and the other freezes. The children came from the temperate twilight band. One misstep through a wormhole or an alien transportation error, and suddenly, boom, here they are in Woolpit. The green skin, well, that's either atmospheric or nutritional adaptation, or a result of photosynthetic biology, aliens with chlorophyll in their skin. The language, well, not a dialect, not even Flemish, it was just alien, Martian. And the diet, oh, it could easily be explained as Earth food isn't exactly USDA compliant on Rigel 7. And even the sound of bells could be chalked up as a spatial resonance from the teleportation process, or a homing beacon from their own technology. The cave became a rapture in space-time. It's the ancient aliens theory with a touch of medieval filter. Now, is there any evidence of this? No. Not even a craft saucer made of beans, maybe? But in fairness, if Roswell can fuel 1 million documentaries, surely Woolpit gets at least one theory on the board. And the logic isn't wildly worse than saying they were radioactive fairies. It just trades a little bit of woodland mysticism for galactic mystery. At the end of the day, both versions want the same thing, a world not like ours, rules we don't even understand, and that enticing thrill of a mystery that refuses to behave. So now let's put away some of the magic and sci-fi, and let's talk about the most grounded and, frankly, in my opinion, the most compelling explanation is rooted not in folklore, but in hard history. And we've touched on it, but let's build on it fully here. In the mid-12th century, Flemish immigrants settled across East Anglia, skilled artisans, weavers, and merchants that brought a distinct culture and a distinct language with them. Some lived in communities like Fornham, St. Martin, just a short walk from Woolpit. And then came the rebellion. In 1173, the Earl of Leicester raised a Flemish army and marched against King Henry II. The uprising was crushed at the Battle of Fornham, and the fallout was severe. After the battle, these Flemish civilians were targeted, their homes destroyed, and entire families were killed and scattered. And maybe, just maybe, in that chaos, 2 children, siblings young and helpless, could have fled into the countryside. Their clothes just simply Flemish, strange to the English eyes. Their language absolutely incomprehensible. The fear of food, trauma, culture shock, maybe even a religious dietary norm. As we mentioned, their green skin, malnutrition, severe iron deficiency. Children growing up in hunger, possibly living on forage weeds or moldy grain, can develop that pallor of a greenish hue. And when finally brought to the Woolpit and fed real food, those such as the iron-rich broad beans, their colors would just fade. And as we've touched on the story of St. Martin's Land, just a simple translation mess up. A place they barely remembered, a name heard in passing, maybe misunderstood, mutated through trauma and translation. All of it makes sense. It's not romantic, it's not magical, but it is achingly human. 2 orphan children, basically war refugee, one survives, one doesn't. And the villagers, unable to explain what they saw, began to build a legend to fit the gaps. But let's stay on that medical lens a moment longer. Green sickness was a diagnosis known for centuries, sometimes associated with adolescent girls, sometimes with poor diet. It was characterized by the following: pale or greenish skin, fatigue, poor appetite, and behavioral withdrawal. It's caused by severe iron deficiency, and before modern nutrition, it wasn't uncommon, especially in children displaced by war, living off roots and beans, drinking contaminated water, hiding in caves or barns, or surviving on one specific crop, say raw legumes. Once refed and placed in care, their symptoms could just easily be reversed. So when chroniclers say the girls lost her green hue over time, it's actually biology here. Her transformation from alien to assimilated wasn't a spiritual journey. It was simply iron in the bloodstream. Now, some scholars believe none of it happened. Or rather, something happened, but it was retold and reshaped into a parable, a Christian narrative about sin, redemption, and community. Consider 2 children emerge from a dark place. One is saved through baptism and assimilation. The other dies. The survivor marries, joins society, and the mystery is absorbed into the faith. The girl becomes a stand-in for the convert. The boy, the damned, the green skin, original sin. The diet, spiritual hunger. The strange land, paganism or heresy. In this view, the story isn't about real children at all. It's about how communities react to outsiders, how difference is feared, then tamed, and then eventually erased. Some scholars have even suggested the tale mirrors the Saxon conquest of Britain, that the green children are echoes of the Britons displaced, misunderstood, and faded into myth. There are a couple more folklore myths around here that we really haven't touched on. The babes in the wood. 2 children abandoned by a cruel uncle, lost in the forest, and ultimately dying under an oak. The story, first recorded in the 16th century, shares some themes: innocence, abandonment, death, and the moral guilt of a society that failed to protect them. Now, some folklorists believe the Green Children legend may have been a precursor, a kernel of truth that evolved into fiction, or maybe vice versa. Either way, both tales force us to ask some uncomfortable questions. Who watches over the lost? And what happens when no one comes looking? And how does a village turn that guilt into a story? And then there's also possibly the simplest explanation to some: 2 children lost. Possibly orphans, possibly escaped servants, possibly just dare I say, lost wanderers. They fall into a pit, they're pulled out, malnourished, terrified, unintelligible, and unfamiliar. The villagers react with confusion, fear, and eventually care. The boy dies, the girl learns, grows, becomes part of the community, and the story told again and again, becoming something else. Something else, and something weird enough to live forever. In the end, every theory is a kind of translation, of fear into folklore, of tragedy into legend, of truth into something we can stomach. Some people will see the fairies, others will see the aliens, some refugees, and others just basic metaphors. But what they're all doing, every one of them, is reaching into the dark and trying to name what they find. And that, more than anything, is what the green children represent. Not answers, but how we invent them. We give those kids a story. We give them skin and saints and twilight. We buried one, we married the other, and then we passed it down. Let's face it, it's what mankind has done for a very, very long time. So some stories end with a death, some with a wedding, but the good ones, the ones with that echo, never really end at all. They linger like fog on a field long after the harvest. And the green children of Woolpit, well, they've managed to linger for over 850 years, depending on who you believe. No one really knows exactly what happened, and no one ever will. But the footprints they left in the soil of English folklore haven't been completely washed away. They survived kings, plagues, reformations, empires. Because it turns out it doesn't matter whether they were fairies, aliens, or malnourished Flemish orphans. What matters is we have never stopped telling their story. And that says more about us than it does necessarily about them. So let's go back briefly to what we know. The one child dying, the one surviving. He learned English, ate real food, worked in a manor house, and possibly even married a man from King's Lynn and vanished into the folds of normal life. She left no known writings, no portrait, no grave. Just a trail of whispers and one extraordinary claim that she came from a world not like this one. Whether that world was real or remembered wrong, whether it existed under the hills or inside a child's trauma-riddled mind, that's beside the point, because her story would travel further than she ever could. It survived because two men put ink to parchment. William of Newburgh, the reluctant believer, Ralph of Coggeshall, the closer witness. They wrote the green children into the margins of history, right next to rebellions and royal births, crusades and miracles. And remember, they didn't necessarily frame it as fable. They framed it as fact. Strange fact, albeit, possibly misunderstood fact, but true enough to preserve. And their gift was simple. They didn't try to explain it. They just told the story and left the rest to us. Fast forward a few centuries, the story goes quiet for a while like a sleeper beneath the hill. Then came the 1500s. The humanist William Camden references the children in his work Britannia, a nod to the tale still alive in local memory. By the 1600s, writers like Robert Burton, the Anatomy of Melancholy, and Francis Goodwin, The Man in the Moon, are name-dropping the green children as curiosities of English folklore. Then the Victorians get hold of it. And they do what Victorians do best. They romanticize the hell out of it. Suddenly, it's in chapbooks and folklore journals. It's paired with other strange happenings from the countryside. It becomes a metaphor for lost innocence, for otherness. For the mystical countryside England was rapidly paving over with trains and factories. They weren't laughing at this story. They were longing for it. And in that, they ended up resurrecting it. Now today, Woolpit is a quiet village, trees, stone cottages, roads that don't go anywhere fast. But if you visit, you'll find a sign near the village green. It's painted in old medieval style with a dark border and stylized lettering. And right there in full color, two green children, the boy and the girl. No longer lost, no longer strange, now part of the town's identity. They stand next to a stylized wolf pit. Their hands are clasped, their skin faintly green, as if the legend has been allowed to breathe but not overwhelm it. There's no monument, no shrine, just that image, as if the village is saying, we do not know what happened here, but we remember it. Now, part of the beauty of this legend, part of why I wanted to talk about it tonight, is that this legend has no canonical version. There's no single master document, no Vatican approved timeline, just two medieval chroniclers, centuries of retelling, and layer upon layer of interpretation. Each generation has seen in the story what it has feared most, or maybe perhaps most desired. To the medieval mind, the children were a divine mystery. To the Victorians, a romantic parable. To folklorists, a portal narrative. To UFOologists, early alien contact. To historians, war orphans wrapped in myth. To sociologists, a story about xenophobia and assimilation. And to the people of Woolpit, local heritage with a dash of weird. And to us here now, they are all of it. Because the green children aren't just a tale, they're kind of a litmus test. What we see when we look at them. If you see two strange children and your first instinct is to feed them, well, that's one kind of story. If your instinct is to convert them, cleanse them, control them, that's a completely different one. If your instinct is to fear them, kill them, bury their memory, that's a third option. And this story has shadows of all three. The villagers fed the children, baptized them, accepted the girl, buried the boy. Some feared them, some helped them, some just simply watched. It's this one tiny story from a forgotten corner of England. We see all the ways humanity handles the unknown. With kindness, with cruelty, with curiosity. But let's not forget the most haunting parts. Really, we've just breezed over it for the most part. Girl lived. The boy didn't. He died within days. Perhaps from illness, perhaps from trauma, perhaps from a world that refused to bend to him. He never learned the language and couldn't eat the food, couldn't adjust, and he vanished. And the girl, well, we've talked about her story. And between the two, the duality, adapt or die, is baked into the story. And that's part of why the story still works. Neither reading is necessarily wrong, because it has room for all. So what did Woolpit find that day? Children, refugees, fairies, something else entirely? The truth is, the pit, it never told us. And maybe it never will. So, it's kind of funny. Today, you'll find the green children referenced in novels, music, children books, folk albums, podcasts, UFO documentaries, and tourist brochures, because, you have to. But you'll find them in conversations between these folklorists, between the locals, between the skeptics and believers. And that's what really, really matters. Because one child died, one child lived. One was buried in a land he didn't understand, the other was absorbed into it. And yet here we are, still talking about them. And not because of the color of their skin, although that is interesting. Not because of where they came from, but because of what they made us see in ourselves. Fear, wonder, and curiosity. So here we are, 60 minutes. That's the game. Normally. But sometimes history, well, like a good hockey team, it just won't clear the zone. So this story isn't going to stay in regulation, because I'm not done skating around this story. So let's lace up, do one more shift with no clocks, no whistles, just some fun fun conversation. When we come back from this next song, welcome to the fourth period.
They came with quiet steps, no banners, no demand. Skin like envy, words like wind, too strange to understand. We built this home from stone and storm, not hate, not fear, not spite. But don't pretend that open doors don't need someone to guard at night. It's not a wall of shame, it's just a lock and key. 'Cause loving you don't mean I lose the right to protect me. Guard the gate but feed the stranger. Draw the line but pull no blade. We stand for love but not for danger. This house was earned, it won't be raised. You see the borders, I see scars where freedom cost its toll. You preach the flood but never ask who cleans up when it rolls. It's not about the skin or name, it's how you come and why. Respect the road, respect the rules, and we'll lift you to the sky. Mercy ain't surrender, it's the strength to choose. But no home stands on promises if the doors can't close or fuse. Guard the gate but feed the stranger. Light the lamp but mind the flame. Truth walks hand in hand with danger. To love this land we name its name. Compassion with no anchor is a ship lost to the tide, and silence in the name of peace leaves the wolves to rule inside. So raise the walls, but build them just, and let the ones who earn it rise in trust. Draw the line and welcome right. We choose the road that honors honor, not blind retreat, not tribal spite. We guard, we give, we
And welcome back to the fourth period. As we go into overtime, since Al is off, I decided to explore this subject with a different light. One I think that ties more into today. And as The story of the green children of Woolpit fades into legend. There's a natural temptation to leave it behind with the rest of the medieval curiosities. A strange account lodged between tales of famine and royal succession, recorded by two monks over 800 years ago. But if we're honest with ourselves, the more unsettling part of the story isn't even the green skin or the twilight homeland or the raw bean diet, although that is really weird. It's that quiet question of the villagers of Woolpit were forced to answer, and one we still face today. What do you do when someone completely foreign arrives in your midst? Now, we live in a world with borders, laws, and national identities. Woolpit didn't have any of those in the modern sense. No passports, no customs, no federal agencies. What they did have was something far older and far more immediate, the raw, instinctive reaction to the other. And somehow, in the middle of a brutal civil war, in a time where heresy and witchcraft could be death sentences, these people encountered two unknown children and chose to act not with fear, but with compassion. And that choice is not just historically remarkable, it's kind of morally instructive. Now, this isn't to romanticize them. We don't know how every villager reacted. We only know that someone, most likely Sir Richard de Conn, took the children in, gave them food, shelter, and baptized them, gave them names, and more importantly, gave them time. Time to learn, to recover, to adapt. In the 12th century, this wasn't just kindness, this was survival. And what makes this, I think, worth revisiting a little bit in the modern era is how often we now frame our discourse around foreignness, especially in the area of immigration, in terms of abstract policy and threat. Now, what happens at the border is debated in courtrooms and on cable news, and our own other shows here on KLRN and SHR Media. But what happens in the neighborhood, in the village square, in the moment when someone different shows up unannounced, that is still deeply human. It's not about laws, about instinct. And at that time, in that era, Woolpit passed their test, at least in this little bit of narrow historical moment. And no, before any angry letters come in, no, this isn't about excusing illegal immigration. This isn't a political argument per se. It's an anthropologic reflection. Because what fascinates me is not necessarily the legality of the green children's arrival, but the humanity of the response. No one in Woolpit asked for two malnourished, nonverbal, oddly dressed children to arrive in the middle of a harvest season. They simply had to decide what now. In that respect, the green children are not just relics of a medieval mystery. They're kind of archetypes. They represent every moment when a community confronts the unknown, whether that's a new language, a new face, or a new culture, and has to decide whether to recoil, to investigate, or to extend a hand. This episode is often framed as folklore or some soft science fiction, or maybe they were alien story. But if we accept the most grounded theory that they were probably Flemish children orphaned and displaced by political violence, then what we're looking at is an early refugee case. And a society that chose to respond with care rather than with sudden punishment or exile. There's no indication they were rounded up, detained, or driven out. They weren't integrated overnight. It took months, maybe even years, but one of them made it. And that detail, quietly noted in both tellings, is perhaps the most haunting of all. The boy did not survive. His sister lived, she adapted, and so forth. In modern terms, we might just simply call this an attrition rate, but in human terms, it's a tragedy and a warning. Integration is not automatic. Not everyone survives displacement, even in the best of circumstances. It takes more than open arms. It takes infrastructure, patience, and a willingness to be inconvenienced by empathy, and for the individual involved to want to. Now, to be clear, the conditions of modern immigration, especially illegal immigration, are vastly more complex than what faced the people of Woolpit. Today, we're dealing with a bunch of systems and media personality that are more for themselves than anything else. We have entire networks of transit, trafficking, policy failures, and geopolitical tension. But because the green children didn't arrive with intent, they weren't an invasion, they weren't economic opportunists or ideological migrants, they were just kids, scared, hungry, and lost. And the village, without understanding them, still responded in a way that prioritized dignity over fear. Now, the lesson of Woolpit isn't that we should ignore caution, for caution is human. The villagers were undoubtedly wary, but they didn't let that masticize into cruelty. And that's the line we walk even today between being cautious and being callous, sometimes rightfully. And let's not forget that assimilation is a two-way street. The girl simply didn't remain an outsider forever. She learned the language, adjusted to the diet, married into the culture. There is a fine balance between welcoming the outsider and asking them to engage with the values of the place they've arrived in. Woolpit remarkably seemed to strike that balance. Children were not worshipped or tokenized. They were folded in, one successfully, one tragically not. Maybe that's actually why part of this story lingers, because it's not a fairy tale. It's not a parable with a morally neatly sewn up at the end. It's a reminder of how difficult and necessary it is to make room for difference without surrendering identity, to show mercy without compromising discernment, to hold your ground and still hold out your hand. To me, if there's a final takeaway from Woolpit, it's this: societies are not remembered for how they repel outsiders all the time. Sometimes they're remembered for how they absorb them or fail to. The villagers could have turned away, could have abandoned those children to those elements. It might have been even easier than what they did, but instead they set an example that resonates not because it was perfect, but because it was decent, measured, and human. In a world that we see increasingly demanding instant judgment about absolute positions and ideological purity, maybe there is something quietly revolutionary about a village that just said, let's see what happens in this one little case. History is filled with sieges and kingdoms, battles and treaties, but once in a while it gives us something just a little bit smaller and a little bit more lasting. Two children, green-skinned and terrified, standing on the edge of a wheat field, and the people who met them there. Now, that said, we have spent the last handful of minutes considering what the villagers did right. Not because they were uniquely noble or unusually enlightened, but because their reaction to two children can offer a quiet blueprint for how humans can respond to the unknown. And yet the response wasn't shaped by government, bureaucracy, or mass media. It wasn't filtered through chain of command policy or national security briefings. It was local, it was personal, it was instinctual, not the sense of fear, but of care. Yes, the children were strange, but they were also vulnerable, and that, more than anything, dictated the villagers' behavior. But what if the strangers who appeared weren't children? And what if, despite their green skin, they didn't resemble us? So let's advance this scenario, if you will. Not necessarily to science fiction, but to a question that, by all statistical logic, will eventually become a very, very real one. How would modern society respond if two extraterrestrial beings, small, intelligent, and clearly not human, appeared on Earth with no warning? Now, this isn't necessarily rhetorical exercise. For decades, scientists and policy theorists have considered this very question under the banner of first contact. The United Nations has loosely theorized about it. SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has published a few white papers. But there's no international standard, no global procedure, no Vatican Council convened in advance. And the history we do have to draw from, the history of how humans treat outsiders, especially those with, unfamiliar language, behavior, and or appearance, is a mixed report card at best. If two gray-skinned, nonverbal beings were discovered in a remote town in Montana or in a farmer's field in rural India, the response would not be local or instinctual. It would be global and immediate. The presence of intelligent non-human life on Earth would be the most significant event in modern history, and with ours, it would be absorbed by the machinery of modern statecraft, media, and military protocol. To be clear, there would be no medieval trial period, no careful period of observation from the village elder, no initial phase of local hospitality. Beings would be detained, not necessarily cruelly, but certainly with a level of control and containment that prioritized risk over relationship. They would likely be transferred to a secure research facility studied by specialists and shielded from the public eye until their nature, origin, and threat level could be assessed. And in that response, we would reveal more about ourselves than about them. And that, to me, is the core of the problem in this. Not because I'm an alien. I mean, that has some impact. But modern society has replaced local moral instinct with procedural skepticism. And in many cases, that's not necessarily wrong. We live in a world with global threats, real dangers, and a need for structured response. But in a moment of true first contact, not with a fleet of ships over the White House, but with just two confused beings that appear simply, boom, they're here, the initial human reaction would be driven less by curiosity and more by containment. And that may be prudent, but is it welcoming? And one could argue that this is an actual necessary evolution. Maybe what the story of Woolpit teaches us. In 1150, the people of Woolpit didn't face bioterrorism, global pandemics, or the risk of artificial intelligence misinterpreting a foreign signal as hostile code. They had their own dangers, yes, but they were simpler in form. The villagers could afford to see the children first as people because they had no tools, social or technological, to reduce them to anything else. In contrast, we have a world built on systems of categorization. As soon as a photo of the Greys hit the internet, every possible lens will be applied. Theologians will speculate. Conspiracy theorists would scream about infiltration. Reddit would erupt into an orgasm of argument. Governments would hold press briefings denying everything while simultaneously initiating high-level containment operations. And somewhere in a quiet lab, two beings who don't speak, don't smile, and don't fit into any known schema would be studied as subjects, not as guests, and have maybe no idea why they're even here. The response would be thorough, it would be professional, and it would be, in the deepest sense, inhumane. But let's rewind. What if they weren't agents of an invasion or the victims of a crash? They were just simply lost, separated from their species, stranded, like the green children, appearing not as conquerors or diplomats, but as castaways. If that's the scenario, and we allow for even the slightest chance of it, then the response becomes not just a test of policy, but a test of character. I know, the idea that highly advanced extraterrestrial species could misplace two of its own may sound absurd. But from a historical perspective, accidental contact is far more common than planned introduction. Columbus didn't set out to meet the Taino people. The Norse didn't write up protocols for Greenlandic Inuit encounters. Most cross-cultural contact on Earth have been accidental, messy, and largely defined by the immediate interpretation of the dominant culture. And more often than not, the dominant culture assumed danger. It's worth asking whether we would do the same. Would we treat these beings, these great children, for lack of a better phrase, with the same instinct for protection that the people of Woolpit applied? Or would we assume their presence was simply a prelude to war? Now, of course, can't ignore the elephant in the room here. Much of the response would hinge just as much on their behavior. If they stood silently and watched, we might assume surveillance. If they tried to flee, we might assume guilt. If they cried, screamed, or behaved erratically, we might assume a health threat. What we almost certainly would not assume is innocence. And this reveals something about our species, something that's may or may not have changed since the 12th century. Yes, back then the presence of an unexplained stranger invited narrative. The villagers, the monks, even the chroniclers built a story around the children, lost, displaced, perhaps magical, perhaps otherworldly, but still worthy of care. In the modern world, do we start with stories anymore? Have stories been beaten out of us? Instead, we start with analysis. We apply frameworks, we run diagnostics, and in doing so, we often strip the subject of humanity before we've even confirmed whether they are, in fact, a threat. This isn't a call for naivetiveness or a blind side for my side to come in and get everyone. First contact, if and when it happens, should be treated with seriousness, but also it should be treated with humility. Because if the green children were somehow not of this world, and that theory is still floated in modern circles, the wolf pit represents maybe the best case scenario for contact. Not because it resolved the mystery, but because it preserved the subjects. It allowed them to live, or at least tried to let both of them live. Yes, one child didn't make it. We don't know the real reason. And the story as passed down offers little detail. But the girl did. In imagining a future first contacts, perhaps the lessons of Wolf Pit is not how we explain the phenomenon, but how we endure its ambiguity. When the world encounters something strange, whether it walks out of a forest, all hairy, like Bigfoot, or emerges from the sea like some Loch Ness monster, or steps from a distant planet, our first choice doesn't have to be one of science, it has to be of ethics. Do we reduce it to data, or do we begin with some dignity? If there is a legacy in the green children of Wolf Pit, it may be not in the truth of the origin, but in the truth of their welcome. The villagers didn't know what they were seeing, but yet some at least knew how to respond, not with fear, but with care, not with certainty, but with patience. If we can remember that in moments when it matters, whether we're dealing with migrants, anomalies, or aliens, we might find ourselves not just prepared for the future, but maybe perhaps more worthy of it. But what do we make of it? Green, two children, green-skinned, wide-eyed, and bewildered, appearing without warning, speaking no language, and vanishing just as mysteriously into the folds of English history. Were they refugees of a civil war, survivors of famine and fear? Something stranger, a living folktale from a world we haven't mapped yet. Whatever the truth, the story of the green children of Wolf Pit endures because it forces us to look inward. It asks us how we treat the unfamiliar, not in theory, but in practice. And whether we still have it in us, as a person, as a group, as a culture, to meet the unknown with curiosity instead of contempt. Because it's, in the end, it's not really about them, about where they came from. It's about who we were when they arrived and their intentions. Thank you for joining me tonight as we've dug through the fog of medieval memory, folklore, and future speculation. If you're still here, still wondering, thank you. That means maybe my spell worked a little. But don't stray too far, because the next episode of In the Crease in 2 weeks, we're heading to a battlefield where the dead refuse to rest. A clash from England's bloody civil war, not just seen, but seen again. We'll have royal investigators, eyewitnesses, centuries of phantom soldiers replaying a battle no one can seem to forget. It's not a legend. It's not rumor. It's a legit documented haunting. That is the Phantom Battle of Edge Hill. Until then, I ask, keep your eyes open, your questions sharp, and maybe your mind just a little off kilter. I'm JEFF, and this was